Of all the current governments of countries in Africa, the Somali government is arguably one of the most unstable. To understand the causes of this instability and to understand what can be done to restore stability back to Somalia, it is necessary to understand Somalia's pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial history. Somalia is a country situated in the Horn of Africa and is surrounded by Djibouti in the northwest, Ethiopia in the west, and Kenya in the southwest. The Indian Ocean encompasses its northern, eastern, and southern borders. There are four major tribes in Somalia that are nomadic and pastoral and make up 70% of Somalia's population. They are the Dir, Darud, Isak, and Hawiye. The Digil and Rahanweyn are two smaller agricultural tribes and make up 20% of the Somali population, while coastal dwellers comprise the last 10% of the Somali population. These tribes have elders who play a crucial role in the survival of the tribes. They decide when to wage war and make peace with other neighboring tribes and decide when to relocate their tribes. In 1839, Somalia first began to experience a clash of cultures between the traditional nomadic and pastoral culture and the new European-influenced Somali state. Competing European powers, France, Italy, and Great Britain, divided the land inhabited by the Somali ethnic group amongst themselves. Only the Italian and British portions of the colony today constitute Somalia. The French colony later became the independent country Djibouti. Britain controlled northern Somalia and used it as a livestock colony, while the Italians desired southern Somalia for plantation agriculture in the form of bananas, sugarcane, and citrus fruits. Because of the stark contrast in the economic policies of Great Britain and Italy, economic advantages and disadvantages began to develop. Over time, nationalists like Saeed Mohammed Abdile Hassan fueled anti-colonial sentiments across Somalia and laid the groundwork for the first modern Somali political group, the Somali Youth League, which had the goal of ending colonial rule in Somalia and liberating the nation from foreign influence and domination. In 1960, the Somali Youth League finally achieved its goal of independence from colonial powers. As a result of independence, the British and Italian colonies of Somalia were unified under one flag. However, rivalry between northern and southern Somalia became inevitable, as the newly developed Somali government failed to address issues concerning underdevelopment and socioeconomic stratification in northern Somalia, problems which were inherited from the colonial administration. This civilian government was inefficient, corrupt, and incapable of creating any kind of political culture. As a result, the Rahanweyn tribe of the north became marginalized from the Hawiye and Darod of the south. Due to a significant number of political differences between tribes, a mass proliferation of political parties occurred, preventing the effective consolidation of power by political parties. General Mohammed Said Barre used this political disarray to launch a successful coup d'etat and overthrow the weak democratic government. Said Barre adopted a policy of scientific socialism, an ideology that he deemed to be fully compatible with Islam and the reality of a nomadic society in Somalia. Under Barre's government, most of the economy sectors were forced into government ownership. These included schools, insurance firms, imports, wholesale trade, and banks. This socialist experiment was ultimately a failure, however, and resulted in a major famine in the north and the deaths of over 20,000 Somalis. Barre's nationalization process and price controls seriously disrupted food markets in Somalia, and the rural population of Somalia has never fully recovered from the disaster. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union competed for access to Somalia as a strategic military location to promote their respective ideologies. Since the Soviet Union promised more military aid than the United States, Said Barre allied the Somali government with the Soviet Union. Somalia was very successful in building its military, which benefited at the expense of other government services. 80% of all foreign aid Somalia received was diverted to the army. In 1977, fighting between Ethiopia and Somalia occurred over the Ogaden region of Ethiopia, an area Somalia attempted to return back to Somali control, resulting in the Ogaden War. The Soviet Union abandoned its support of Somalia and backed Ethiopia, causing a reversal of alliances and subsequent American support of Somalia. While Barre did gain American backing, the Somali defeat forced a flood of Somali refugees and eroded the credibility of the Somali army and police. Senior military officers attempted a coup in April of 1978, forming the Somali Salvation Democratic Front. Former army officers, businessmen, religious leaders, and intellectuals of the Isaaq clan formed a second opposition movement called the Somali National Movement. The Hawiye-dominated United Somali Congress and the Ogaden-led Somali Patriotic Movement were also formed by the time the Somali state virtually ceased to function. The war between Bahrain and rebelling factions destroyed market centers and the ability of farmers to produce crops, as the war caused farmers to abandon cultivation for the 4 years of the conflict. During the height of the Somali Civil War, which was between 1991 and 1992, a major drought hit the area, resulting in a large famine that killed between 300,000 and 500,000 people. Furthermore, the war in southern Somalia uprooted an estimated 1.7 million people, which was over one-third of the entire southern Somali population. By 1990, the United States had put Bahrain and his regime on public notice due to its human rights violations and general misconduct, and in 1991, Bahrain was overthrown and left Somalia. The government's physical structures were pillaged and torn apart to be sold for scrap. As of January 1991, Somalia has existed without a functional central government, and several national peace conferences to bring stability to Somalia have failed. Warlords began to emerge from the conflict and took advantage of interclan and intra-clan tensions to rise to power. For instance, in the United Somali Congress, a conflict arose between Ali Mahdi Mohammed and General Mohammed Farah Aidid. Aidid mobilized his forces against other warlords and became Mogadishu's most powerful warlord, and even targeted UN peacekeepers who came to Somalia to help those in need. In the Battle of Mogadishu, forces of the United States attempted to seize 2 of Aidid's lieutenants, but were attacked by armed civilian fighters. 18 American soldiers were killed in action. In 1995, the United Nations withdrew its operations from Somalia, and Somalia has remained a collapsed state. The power vacuum in Somalia ultimately allowed for the rise of the first generation of Sharia courts, since they offered rule of law and facilitated internal relations. These Sharia courts were controlled by a coalition of local interests, including clan elders and business people. Eventually, the Sharia courts became springboards for a new radical Islamist movement that eroded the power of warlords from 1995 to 2006. While the creation of a transitional national government by the Nairobi Peace Accords in October of 2004 led to a temporary decline of Sharia militias, Somali Islamists experienced a rapid rise to power from 2005 to 2006, and a decisive victory over a group of US-backed militia leaders posing as a counter-terrorist coalition. The umbrella organization of the Sharia courts, the Supreme Council of Islamic Courts, is also associated with the terrorist group Al-Shabaab and poses a challenge to secular and traditional leaders, the TFG, neighboring states, and the West. The entire political and economic mainframe of Somali society has been shifted by the SCIC. Sharia courts have replaced municipal authorities, watch patrols have been dismantled, and traditional elders, civic leaders, and some business people have all been marginalized. The US-supported Ethiopian invasion of Somalia in December of 2006, Ethiopia was forced to occupy Mogadishu to prop up the unpopular TFG. The Ethiopian army was marked by rampant human rights abuses, and Washington aggravated the outrage by dropping bombs on terrorist targets and killing scores of civilians. Radical Islamic jihadists from the Middle East came to Somalia, and by the time the Ethiopian forces withdrew in early 2009, the influence of the terrorist group Al-Shabaab had spread throughout southern Somalia. The Bush administration treated Somalia as a front in the war on terrorism. As a result, there are 2 dominant camps in Somalia, the pro-Western PFG and the radical Al-Shabaab. The line separating the 2 groups is very thin, and there are actually similarities between the 2. For example, both are driven by clannish and economic interests that often trump ideology in determining allegiances, as members of the TFG have been accused of selling munitions to Al-Shabaab. Even if the TFG were given more territory to control, the result would be the same as the status quo, since the government is simply incapable of governing. To restore stability in Somalia, there needs to be a complete overhaul of U.S. foreign policy with regards to Somalia. The exact nature of the threat that Somalia poses to the United States' national security must be understood. For instance, piracy is prevalent in the weakly governed northern regions, and not in Somalia's anarchic south. a policy of constructive disengagement should be adopted. This is because had it not been for the United States' counterterrorism efforts, the size of the Sharia courts and al-Shabaab in Somalia may have remained small. Having a common enemy, the United States allowed the terrorist groups in Somalia to gain momentum and nationwide enthusiasm. The United States should commit itself to a strategy that involves development of Somalia without regard to governance, and the United States should learn to understand the value of relationships that local rivals build in pursuit of common economic goals. The outcomes of this method may not necessarily benefit the United States, but pursuing more assertive outcomes will backfire on the United States.